session, I brought mostly just image examples to show these texture tools in action and how you can use them. And also everything that I'm showing is in the normal Baselight software that's available for all of our customers. So we're not using any kind of beta version here, so that's all in the software right now. So the most obvious thing to manipulate MTFs is to match different lens MTFs. And on this shot here, we have the face of the male singer is sharper, and the female singer, because she's positioned more to the side of the frame, and this is a very soft lens and maybe a vintage lens, she really lacks a little bit of the sharpness from the male singer. I'm zooming in into many examples so that also the people in the more in the back can have a better view. So what I'm doing here is now I added basically a rough shape with a strong feather for her, and put a texture equalizer in, and so now I will just try to match her better to him. And the key thing here is, so I could also try this with a typical sharpen algorithm, but a typical sharpen will boost up the highest frequencies the most, and actually it would then destroy a little bit that softish character of the lens there, because in the end, it's not a really super sharp lens. It still has a soft character, and so then we are able to get something much better than before. And here we can then keep the highest frequencies down if we think we're over-sharpening to some extent. So that's a really powerful tool there. Another example, you can just, I guess, imagine that if you have something that you started working on a projection, and then you move to maybe your new OLED HDR display in the TV room, that it will look maybe a little bit too sharp. You can then try to use a texture equalizer preset to bring everything down without really crudely blurring all the details out, but yeah, find a nice compromise. If you have HD content and you need to upscale it to Ultra HD, you can then try to use the texture equalizer to just boost up a little bit in the highest frequencies. So it will then add that little bit of sparkle there. Maybe I will also zoom in a little bit. That's then maybe missing on these shots. So this is without. This is with, and the shots will not look overly sharpened. And also, I'm not saying that you need to do this. I think Ultra HD or 4K does not have to be sharper, but I know that also that sometimes the conditions or the people paying for the whole thing, they expect something that looks then more like Ultra HD or 4K, and I think also the texture equalizer might be a nice way to do that. Obviously, the most fun part is then to create any kind of artificial MTF curves on images to use them in a creative way. So on this shot, we can try to produce maybe a much softer look. And so I'm moving most of the sliders to the left side, but we can then keep the highest frequencies where they are. So I'm just adjusting it a little bit and maybe also zooming in. So this is before, this is after. So we can use this in a highly creative way to generate very soft kind of, yeah, I would say artificial texture or MTF curves, and use them in a heavily creative way to achieve kind of interesting looks. So what's especially popular is doing very soft looks, but without being out of focus in the end. So you can go really, really soft without blurring the image. On this bubble shot, we can also just play a little bit around with the different frequencies, and then we can influence the appearance of the different sized bubbles. Another tool that we're having in Baselight for a while is the texture blend operator. So it's a real layer that you can put below two images. So what I'm having here is this image and that image, and I'm having a texture blend below. And what the texture blend is doing, it's mixing these two images based on frequencies. So I'm now starting to move the sliders over one by one. So this is the highest frequency, the first octave, and now going through. Now we can start to see that there are some that the fine details of the other image are now coming over, and that the shot of the two girls is getting softer and softer. And it's not nothing that you would do on a real image. This is just for you to showcase what that operator is doing. And as I move over frequency by frequency, we can see that the image then transforms into the other one. And also notice that the color information is living mostly in the lowest frequencies, in the lowest octaves. So until now, we see only a little bit of color coming over from the mountain shot, just maybe a little bit of the red of the climber there. And as soon as I move over then the lowest frequency, we will then realize, okay, so now we're having 100% the other shot. So this is just to showcase what that layer or operator is doing. So it's an extremely powerful operator. We can use it, for example, for something like this. So here I made a, say, really bad curve grade. So I changed the lightness based on the hue on the grass, and that introduces these really unpleasant results. So what are we going to do? Maybe we will blend back the shot with itself, but without the correction, just for the higher frequencies. So I'm now moving over the higher frequencies of the shot without the curve grade correction. And we're now applying basically the grade only to the lower frequencies. And what we can see now is that from there we go to here, so we can basically smooth out these kind of sharp edges and noisy things. And another example, I'm just resetting it. So here I added a diffuse operator, so that's adding a lot of diffusion from the highlights. And we can do a similar thing again. We can say, okay, let's apply the diffusion, but let's blend back the highest frequencies of the original image. And so moving them now over one by one. Maybe a little bit more here. And so what we can see now is we can avoid making the shot look too soft and too out of focus, but we're still having the diffuse active. So if I'm now just bypassing the diffuse before and after, we can see, so now we're still diffusing, but only in the lower frequencies, and which gives us then different results, a lot of creative possibilities. The same thing you could try with softening tools, skin softening tools, or blurs, and so forth. What is a little bit complicated about the texture blend thing is it's a lot of work to put it into a stack. So you need to insert a reference to define what do you want to blend with, and then you need to drive all the time all these 6 sliders. So that's not something that you want to do that often during a grading session where you have high pressure and you also need to work very quick. So we came up with another solution, which we call the blend mode. I'm going to explain to you what it's doing. So this is again the picture of the Daniele's black and white fence. And let's get in a Luma waveform. So we can here go through the different octaves and push them up or down. What I'm doing now on that shot is I'm adding a film grade operator, and I set the contrast to 0, which means we're making the whole thing gray. So now our waveform now became a straight line. Now I'm setting the blend mode of that layer. So we added a new texture blend mode in 5.2 to Baselight, along with all the other standard blend modes. It's called texture blend. If you now move the blending slider over, you can see what's happening. So now I'm blending back the high frequencies and applying my correction only to the lowest frequencies. So this slider here is basically driving all the other 6 sliders in a kind of specific pattern where we say this makes a lot of sense. And the net result is that our correction in the layer, whatever we now put into our layer, so we can put all the tools that are available in Baselight into it, and with the texture blend mode, we can now bring them to the texture domain and apply them only to the lower frequencies, which is the most typical use case. But we can also do the opposite. We can also apply them if I'm moving in my layer flow graph here, if I'm moving my grading operators to the right branch, we're then setting the texture blend to only affect the high frequencies. So we can also do the opposite. We can also apply any grading that we're doing inside a layer, all the tools that we have, only to the high frequencies. And having it as in this texture blend mode is a very convenient and very quick way to use it during grading. So here we have a shot with a very soft look. So there's a lot of haze and fog from the jacuzzi in it. Let's work against it and add a lot of contrast to it. And again, what Daniele showed in the beginning, we see that here on these parts of the jacuzzi in the front, we get a much higher sharpness than before. If I'm now turning off that layer on and off, we can see we're also changing the texture of the shot and adding a lot of sharpness. Now with the texture blend mode, I can now just blend back the original texture for that correction. So I hope you can see what I'm doing. I can also just bypass this now. So now I can bypass just the texture blend mode. So this is without, this is with. And we can see that now if I'm flipping back between without correction and with correction, we can see that the texture stays much more like in the original or like before the correction. So we can now finally dissect the two operations, sharpness and color, and we can apply a correction only to both of the things. So color corrections don't necessarily mean we also changing the texture with that blend mode. Another thing is that grading through texture blend mode with only on the lower frequencies feels also very organic. On this shot, I'm pushing up the highlights now in a very dramatic way. And we can see again, they're getting like quite sharp. And so when I'm grading with only lower frequencies, we can see that when I'm pushing the highlights up now they start to glow, which gives a very organic feeling to the thing. So when you're moving, if you're doing like heavy corrections and you're doing it inside or below or a texture blend mode, it then feels very organic, and maybe you will not need to drive it all to max out, but maybe only to a certain level. But I'm encouraging you to try it out. Yet also just bypass before and after of that very strong correction. So the thing that we're seeing here is basically domain crosstalk. So if we think about what if we would have a single white pixel which is surrounded by fully black pixels, how would that come out on different displays? So if we would laser that out on a film and then project it, it would not look like this anymore on the screen, but maybe more like one of the three other ones. So this is what we call a point spread function. So that describes how would a single point be modulated under certain circumstances. Also CRT monitors that we used for a long time, they also, when we would shoot a single pixel white somewhere, it would add a little bit glow from the phosphor. And the interesting thing about CRTs is they even had domain crosstalk to the temporal domain. So when you had a very bright thing somewhere, it had a slight afterglow on the next frame. Basically, that domain crosstalk, it's technically not an ideal thing to have, but aesthetically, it's something that we seem to prefer. Before these displays arrived, like OLED or micro LED, that show a white pixel like this. So basically, an OLED screen can show a white pixel directly next to a black pixel, which is technically a good thing. And now, in the first time, we see the true signal that we're really working on, because a CRT display, also a digital projector, because it goes through a lens, does not really show us the true signal that we're working on. And in the end, we prefer the softer one, so we prefer one of the maybe softer point spread functions, but the signal that we are creating is looking more like this. And so if you put something like this into the archive and then someone will project it maybe on a festival in a couple of years on an LED cinema wall, maybe we will not really like what we delivered as a colorist anymore, because we see maybe suddenly lots of noise or lots of these highlights that Daniele already showed. So in the end, we now need to start to manage MTF curves of our image much more now. And going to HDR, it gets even more important. So here we have the texture highlight tool, and that's basically simulating like a softer point spread function on an image. And I mean, Daniele already showed you the other examples. Here, this is just another one, and can also bring back the Luma waveform again. So here again, we can see that these lights were originally clipped all to the same level, and by adding the texture highlight, which is then basically reducing the contrast of the highest frequencies, but only in the highlights, we then get a much more pleasing result on that shot for the highlights. And the other good thing about this is, so now we limited our signal to that kind of curve. So now if we show it on a projector or on an OLED screen, it will look much more similar because we've taken out all the things that a projector can't show with its lens. Here another example, I already added a shape to the right side of the character's face, and a typical thing to do here maybe would be to crunch up the highlights, and maybe for outside of the shape, let's add a little bit of cold tones and the shadows. Here we have it now. So now we're adding with our correction again a lot of sharpness, and our shape getting a little bit visible because we have different texture now on the right side of the face than on the left side. And with the texture blend, we can again blend back the original texture, and then this is just before after of the texture blend, and then our correction will stay more natural. Similar thing here. So here I added shape for his face to light it up a little bit. I can show you the before. And again, here we see that when we light up the face, light would not really interact with the face in that way, because also we have a little bit of noise in it here, but also light would not really interact on the highest frequencies that sharp. Again, the texture blend. Also with any other corrections that are pushing really hard on the image. So here what we can try is changing the hue of the door maybe in the background. And also the tricky thing is, as soon as we usually start to change the luminance of things, maybe let's also drop the luminance of the reds dramatically. What is happening? Typically, yeah, we're introducing noise and it's not really usable on the shot. We slide over texture blend. We can still have our correction that we added, but without the noise. Again, another thing that I added here is some more brightness to the eyes, and I intentionally I didn't do the shapes in a kind of perfect way that I was adding here, so they're a little bit sharply cut out, so they're getting very obvious. But with the texture blend, whole shapes then integrate much better with the image. And especially on this one here, because on the first frames of the shot, she's a little bit out of the focus, and then she moves into the focus for a couple of frames. So typically for shapes like this, we would then might need to animate the feather or add a blur to the shape signal to keyframe that. But with the texture blend, we can also save us this thing, because we only apply it to the low frequencies, so it will do the same correction, or it will integrate this as well in out of focus and in focus on the shot. This also here, it's in full screen again, before, after. Another typical problem is curve grades, where we change the luminance based on hue or saturation. I guess we all colorists know that you should be really careful about that. Here I put something to the sky. This is without the correction. This is with, that introduces a lot of noise. And I guess you can already imagine. Move texture blend over. And we still see a little bit of noise, but that's actually the noise that was already there in the original. So it's not killing the noise, but what the texture blend is doing, it's avoiding amplifying the noise with all your corrections. You might also notice that here on these lights, we have these blue and magenta fringes, which are typical interaction of lenses with digital cameras. I also have a solution for that. So the typical approach here would be to go to our hue shift tool and desaturate the magentas. That's helping a little bit, but we realize we also need to desaturate the blues, actually. Why is nothing happening? Because it's here. Okay, let's go back. So this is just the magenta, and if I then desaturate the blues, we can see, okay, but now we also desaturated the sky completely. What if we could just desaturate the blue and the magenta for the high frequencies, which basically means these sharp edges? Yeah, I guess you can already know that we have a solution for that. So now I would need to move the grading operators to the right side with the texture blend mode. That now means, okay, now let's take out the high frequencies. And so now I can move that slider over. So this is before, this is after, and you can also see that it's now not having any kind of effect on the sky, because the sky lives in the low frequencies, and so we can also solve that. And probably you now already crave for me adding maybe a little bit of texture highlight to the light there, that's not blinding us that much anymore. Another use case for the applying a correction only to the high frequencies is to work on the shadows. So the same thing that we have with the texture highlight for the highlights, so giving us a really softish look in the highlights. Sometimes we also desire for the shadows if we have like really harsh blacks, and maybe even if we have some noise. So what I'm doing here now is going to our film grade operator and raising the shadow level up tremendously, so that makes it very milky. But what I'm now doing is I'm really squeezing the shadows together, so also all the noise that's living down there is now squeezed together. And now I'm applying that correction again only to the high frequencies. And now you can see now we get a very creamy look on the shadows. Now I move the slider all the way down, so maybe we would say it's now a little bit too much. I mean, you have the full creative control over that, but it also gives a very interesting look, maybe like a Black Promised. And also it's really then also compressing the noise down there without using any kind of noise reduction that would introduce artifacts. So here we have a close-up with a lot of details in the skins. So I guess you can already imagine we can put a texture equalizer on that. Yeah, I already prepared that. So then we can reduce. So the key thing would be again to reduce maybe the mid frequencies, keep the high frequency up, or even here I pushed it a little bit up to I guess counter a little bit to the softer mid frequencies. So this is something that we can do. But I also prepared something else here. So I added, so I made a skin tone key, and in that key, basically added like a Gaussian blur. So I blurred it by 30 pixels, which is yeah, really a lot. And I also reduced a little bit the contrast in it. So that's now doing something like this, which yeah would be definitely flagged as too photoshopped. But with the texture blend mode, you can now blend back the original texture of the skin if we want to. So for the high frequency, so we can blend back a little bit of the pores just for that correction. And so now we still have, again, a kind of softish result, but much more believable because the high frequencies are staying there. Another thing that we can work on, especially with skin, I need to zoom in quite a lot, is that typically skin, if we really examine the individual color values that we have, we can see that it's really made up of a lot of different color values, and that's usually what we like. So that's giving a kind of vivid feeling to a face or to a skin. But what we can also do is so here I did like a sepia thing, so I desaturated and then tinted it in a kind of warmish tone. And if I'm now applying this only to the highest frequencies, so I might now zoom in back again, we can see that we now also can control how much variation we want in the skin. So this is now maxed out. point where we see a little bit more color variation in the skin. So this is not necessarily something that we should do on skin all the time, but maybe sometimes we don't like the color variation on the high frequency. So here another shot, and here we can do something similar. So I here added already a shape for the eye. And here we can maybe try to do the opposite. So here, what if we maybe want to increase the color variation here on the high frequencies for the iris? So what I did is I added a lot of saturation. Now I'm going to apply that saturation only to the highest frequencies. And so here now we can see we can basically boost up the color variance in the eye and also giving us maybe an interesting effect. So this is the exactly opposite thing that I did compared to this last thing on the skin on the other shot. So we can also use it in that direction. And another thing that I did here is I basically painted out a lot of dots. Or actually, I did not really paint them out. I just added a Gaussian blur to that layer. And I already blended it back with texture blend, a little bit the fine details. So if I would take that back, so I'm not sure. Yeah, I guess here it's maybe a little bit more visible. So here we see these kind of like blurred dots that look very unnatural. And if we blend back a little bit of the original texture, then they come back to a more normal. And also on that shot, I have all the time active already a pretty strong texture equalizer again, just working in general and giving us that kind of softish look. And so the last example for today is this one here. I'm adding a vignette on the shot. And so here I will try to bring out the two characters a little bit nicer, also maybe with adding some contrast. So the vignette should be feathered strongly to the outside. Let's bring in some contrast, wow, and raise the exposure a little bit. And so now what we can see is by bringing up the contrast, we see that the glass that they were filmed through has a very fine texture on it. And now again, by adding the contrast, we're not boosting up the characters, but also the glass with the texture. And I guess you can already guess, if we add the texture blend to it, we can now take out the correction from the glass. So now we're mostly just bringing up the two characters, which is nice in this case, but we could also do the opposites. I could also say, okay, so then maybe I want to just grade on the window. So now I'm just switching the texture blend to the other side, now only affecting high frequency. So now I'm grading just mostly the window in this case, which is maybe not as desirable, but yeah, depends on the story and what we want to achieve. These are not vector paints, but it's obviously trackable. So I also, as you can see, if it's when the UI is updating here, or when the image is updating, you can see that they are tracked to the layer or to the face. And so what we can do is we have certain influences on the strokes that we made. So we can so I can adjust the width of all the paint strokes later, or the hardness, or the opacity. I can also adjust the last stroke. But in the end, the paint strokes are generating me a matte, and then I'm tracking the matte onto the image. So you're not tracking every individual paint stroke. You could do that in the paint tool. We can add layers, and each layer can have a different tracker. So you could add every paint stroke to a new layer and then track them all individually, and then adjust them also afterwards individually. But typically what you would do is you would put them in groups. And if you're working on a face, then maybe having one group for the nose, one for upper lip, lower lip, and you can then use individual trackers for them and adjust them also afterwards individually. And this is, so in Baselight we have a classic paint tool like a clone and clone stamp, but this what I used here is what we call a matte brush. So I can basically paint a matte onto the image. So every correction that I do, I can paint on the image. And the really nice thing about it is that I can paint with lower opacity. So when I'm starting to paint here, and then I'm going over it again, we should be able to see that the matte then gets, maybe let's go to a black and white matte, or to this one, we can then see that the matte gets thicker and thicker. So that's a really nice way of applying correction if you want to be really gentle and really organic. So that's for certain cases it's working much better than putting a shape on a shot. But obviously it's more for the jobs where we have very detailed work for not much content. So if we need to finish an hour a day, you will probably not spend much time painting things onto faces. But if you do a commercial where you have 10 hours for a minute, then you will definitely do it a lot, I guess. In the end, you can add a texture blend to every layer that you're adding, and there's technically no limit of using tens or hundreds of them on a shot. If you just use the blend mode that we have here, it's also not polluting your stack with like lots of things. But if you do really complex things that I showed in the beginning with the texture blend operator, where I'm blending the two images, completely different images, it would then add more objects to your stack. So it might then get a little bit higher than usual, but also it's an extremely powerful tool. And usually, I guess you would not use it. It really depends on how many layers you're putting. I mean, on a commercial, you can some people easily putting 30 to 50 layers, maybe sometimes. Then it would add up. But I guess typically you will only use it on the things where you do the heavy lifting or the crazy stuff that might introduce some noise. And that's usually not so many of the layers. Often you do very subtle things, I guess. All right, so I hope everyone thinks different about texture from now on. Thanks again.